sort of stuff. Okay, right. Okay, everybody. Right. I'm attempting to wear a mic today so I can walk over and use the board. So we'll see how this works. Before we get started, well, two things. Well, three actually. First of all, I've already received a bunch of essay plans from people. You've got to the end of the day to get one to me if you want. All it needs to be is a sheet of paper, like A4 size with, you know, a rough idea of what you want to do. And me and Zoe will get these back to you within 2 weeks. Second thing, you may or may not have already heard, but there is some planned strike action from the UCU, which might disrupt the lectures. I'm not entirely sure how this is going to work yet, but I will be in touch with everybody to make sure you all know what's happening. Thirdly, so this half of term is about the Aristotelian theology, which emerged in the Middle Ages. It's kind of popular under scholasticism and also popular in other Abrahamic faiths, so Islam and Judaism. That means I need to explain a certain amount of Aristotle to you, but you're also going, or at least a lot of people are going to get a course also taught by me on Aristotle in more depth next term, so I don't want to kind of overlap too much. And also I would quite like to get to the philosophy at the end of the lecture, which is based on the optional reading, which is really weird and interesting. So what I've decided to do is try and give you a smaller Aristotle, but if at any point you think you don't understand what's going on or you'd like something to be explained more, please put a hand up and I will expand the Aristotle at the expense of the Meillassoux at the end. So, that's everything. Let's get cracking. So, our questions this week are, why is the world the way it is? And secondly, could it be otherwise? The way I want to break this down is firstly by thinking about the world and then talking about what we mean by the way it is. In fact, I might need some more space, so let's get rid of this in front of you. We've talked about the world in at least two different ways, right? And this is very clear to anybody who read Wittgenstein a couple of weeks ago. On the one hand, we can kind of talk about the world in terms of facts, what's true, right? And on the other hand, we can talk about the world in terms of things. So Wittgenstein quite famously said, the world is the totality of facts, not the totality of things. Got different ways of thinking about this. And crucially, what I'd like to sort of contrast here is what we might call facts and laws, and things and types. Okay. So when we think about what makes up the world, it's not just facts about, you know, so for instance, taking the example I did a while ago, like where a hurricane falls. Like, did the hurricane hit Cuba? Did it hit Florida? That's a fact, right? We're also interested in the laws that in some sense explain why that fact is true, the reasons why it is wrong, right? Similarly, when we think about things, like for instance, a hurricane or a person or an animal, right? We are often interested in what type of things they are. Often because the types explain the kinds of law-like generalizations we use to think about the facts about these things. So, biologists are going to break down the animal kingdom into a hierarchy of genus and species, and they'll use that to talk about, like, well, okay, what kind of thing is a mammal and what general things can we claim about all mammals, right? So this is kind of a very rough way of thinking about the world, and this is, in a certain sense, everything, right, in opposition to nothing, which we've talked a bit about. What about the way the world is? Here we need to start talking about what technically gets called modality. What I mean by that is possibility, necessity, actuality, and contingency. These are the kind of key terms that are going to be dictating everything we do this lecture. So crucially, the distinctions I kind of want to make are between actuality and possibility. And between necessity and contingency. Just to give you a little bit of a feel for that, actuality is the way the world is. The world is actually a certain way. But you might think that there are other possibilities that were not actualized. The world could have been other ways. Maybe there were other possible worlds, like Leibniz things, right? Or maybe there's just certain like hypothetical situations we can think about. Like, you know, again, I might have gotten the flu and not turned up today, and then Zoe would have had his lecture, right? It's a possibility. Similarly, we talk about necessities and contingencies, like the necessary things, things that could not have been otherwise, right? You might want to say that, it just couldn't have been otherwise that, an example, no? No. Let's take law-like generalizations again. Like, it just couldn't be otherwise that if we emitted a certain amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, that the average temperature of the planet would rise. It's kind of like, that's a necessity which is a result of a law. Right? But there are other things that are actual but not necessary. And that's what we mean by the contingent. Right? It's perhaps contingent that I became a philosopher, I might become a baker. Right? But nevertheless, we might want to say it's necessary that I, I'm a mammal and I'm composed of cells and DNA. These are things that we couldn't change without me no longer being me. But whether I became a philosopher or a baker, that's another matter. Right? Necessity, contingency. Okay. And we might oppose these if we're talking about possibility. We might oppose these to impossibility. What is impossible? So, for instance, to use a very classic example, a round square. Right? So you can't have something that is both a square and round. Or, for instance, the largest prime number. There isn't a largest prime number. It's an impossible idea. Okay. So, could it be otherwise? If the world is actually the way it is, could it be otherwise? And there are three different ways to formulate this question. Right? One might be, could it be otherwise than we think. Right. Could the world be different than we think it is? Right. And this isn't a question about possibility. An example of the difference here would be, like, on the one hand, we can ask, what would the world be like if JFK hadn't been shot by Oswald? Right. It's a kind of hypothetical. But this kind of question is rather, what if Oswald didn't shoot JFK? We just think he did. Right. And the truth is a different thing. So this is a kind of epistemic modality. It's about certainty and uncertainty. Are we certain this is the case? Then we have the other kind of example, which is, could it have been otherwise? Like, you know, could the Nazis have won the Second World War? Right. Anybody who's been watching the Man in the High Castle series? It's your question. Right. And finally, a slightly different one, which is, could it become otherwise? So maybe fascism necessarily failed last time. Could it succeed this time? Somewhat of a topical question. Here's a very specific example I want to give of this, and I want you to bear it in mind because it's important for when we get to Meillassoux. Everybody come across the Diary of Anne Frank? Yeah. Okay. Right. We know about Anne Frank and the way in which her life was cut tragically short by the Holocaust. Right. So we might say, are we certain she died? Like, is it possible that somehow she was escaped and whisked off somewhere else and lived a life in secrecy? Right? Could she have lived? Like, could it have been the case that, like, the Holocaust never happened and she lived a happy life? Thirdly, could she live again? Right? Could the world become such that, like, her death is undone? And that's the big theological question that we'll get to at the end. Bear that example in mind. So, let's talk about history, and let's talk about Aristotle. Who is Aristotle and why is he important? So, Aristotle was a student of Plato. And crucially, he was kind of pushed out of the academy. He then went and taught Alexander the Great. It was like Alexander the Great's personal tutor. So had quite an impact on history. And he then went back to Athens and founded an alternative to Plato's academy called the Lyceum, where they'd walk around this Greek temple talking to one another. So Aristotle's school is called the Peripatetic school, which basically means that the philosophers who walk. They walk around chatting to each other, like it's the West Wing. I think the other important things to know about Aristotle is that just as Plato was obsessed with mathematics and geometry, Aristotle was obsessed with biology and empirical science. Aristotle was obsessed with the kind of empirical task of going out, looking at the world and categorizing it. And a lot of the ways in which the disciplines involved in contemporary natural science work are the way they are because we inherit sets of distinctions from Aristotle. So, I was talking about how biologists might create these hierarchies of genus and species. That's Aristotle's idea. It's a bit modified, but it comes down from him. The other thing that it's important to understand is that Aristotle's works were basically lost to the West. After like the burning of the Library of Alexandria and the fall of Rome and all this sort of stuff, we kept hold of Plato and Neoplatonism, but Aristotle's works were largely left. However, in the Middle East and in the Islamic world, they still have copies of Aristotle's works, and Aristotle became incredibly influential upon Islamic philosophy and theology. And we're going to consider one Islamic theologian today, Ibn Sina, who is in his own right very important because he's probably the father of modern medicine. Like a doctor obsessed with trying to understand the nature of disease, but he also wrote treatises on philosophy and theology inspired by Aristotle. And it's through the Islamic world that Aristotle's ideas come back into the West and then become the basis of the doctrine of the church. So like official Catholic doctrine is basically Aristotelian. Right? And I think the thing you need to understand about Aristotle to understand why this is that whereas Plato gives us a bunch of different dialogues, and we can kind of argue about what did Plato really mean, like what was Plato's real picture of the world, right? We're not sure, there's disagreements, right? Aristotle gave us a complete systematic view of everything, right? For someone in the Middle Ages coming across Aristotle, it was like finding the guy who'd given you the handbook to the entirety of reality, right? And this is why Aristotle is so important. Right? He comes up with all these distinctions and all these divisions between different disciplines and kinds of knowledge that are inherited and still with us. Now, how did Aristotle actually differ from Plato? I think there's sort of two key differences here. Let me use the board again. How did Aristotle... There goes my pen. How did Aristotle differ from Plato? Well, I've already said that Aristotle was interested in empirical science. And the key thing to understand here, basically, is that whereas Plato sort of privileges the intelligible over the sensible, Aristotle kind of turns it the other way around. Right? Aristotle says, no, we actually need to pay attention to the sensible. And it's only through making sense of the sensible world that we get a grip on the intelligible principles underlying it. So for Plato, the sensible is just the unreal, it's merely apparent. For Aristotle, this is the real. And the other way this comes about is he basically says that we have to focus on individuals rather than universals. So for Plato, the ideas are what are real. The idea of man is the reality, and the actual many men or women or whoever are around, these are just merely apparent. Right? For Aristotle, the key to reality is in real individuals, what he called primary substances, and the types, the universals, are secondary substances. We come to understand that what's common to snails by looking at actual snails. And that's the kind of core of Aristotle's switch from Plato. There's sort of two other things I want to explain about Aristotle quickly. Okay, I'll tell you what, I'm going to try and use other board and we'll see if this works. Is that Aristotle is one of the first philosophers to think about modality in the way I presented it before. Right? Aristotle is very clearly interested in the distinction between actuality and possibility. And the key thing to understand is that Aristotle favours actuality over possibility. He thinks actuality is the important thing, and possibility is secondary. Right? And there's sort of two other distinctions that are worth bringing in here. So he thinks about actuality as activity, and possibility is mere kind of passivity. And this is tied into his conception of form and matter. I'm not going to go into that, but we might go into it at another point. And to tie this off, when he combines these two distinctions together, you get the distinction between act and force. So the way in which Aristotle conceives the world is that possibilities are inherent in things. They're not just free-floating possible world, right? I have the possibility of sitting down or standing. I have the possibility of giving this lecture or running away, right? These are capacities I have as the kind of individual I am, right? But they're rooted in the fact that I'm an actual human being, an actual individual, right? And crucially, he thinks of actuality as the realization of a capacity. I'm giving this lecture. Right? It's actual because I'm acting. And passivity is that which merely receives it. Right? So the way in which Aristotle tends to view the entirety of reality is in terms of what you might call a master metaphor of craft. Aristotle thinks of the world on the model of a sculptor taking a piece of clay and turning it into a statue. Right? The sculpture acts and makes the statue actual. Right? And the clay is merely passive potential. Potential waiting to be realized through some kind of action. Right? Okay. Final thing I will say about Aristotle is it's important to understand Aristotle's conception of the world and how change fits into it. So, crucially, Aristotle will just talk about motion. What he means by motion is just any kind of change. What we normally think about motion is it's movement in space. It's change of position. That's only one kind of change according to Aristotle. Aristotle thinks the whole world is perhaps broken down into three levels. You have the prime mover, which is basically his conception of God. Right? We might talk about that as the unchanging. Right? Aristotle's prime mover is in some sense unchangeable, right? But not because it's outside of time. Rather, the prime mover is the thing that makes time function because it makes everything move. Right? So beneath that you have the heavens, right? Stars and the planets. And fundamentally what that is unchanging change. Right? The planets, as far as Aristotle is concerned, yeah, they change position, they move around in circles, but that change does not itself change. It's perfect. And then beneath that, you have the Earth and us. And we are, in a certain sense, changing change, right? Which is to say, the heavens are perfect, and we are imperfect. We are corrupted. So Aristotle already gives you a kind of monotheistic cosmology, which can be picked up and made into a theology. The thing that differs in Aristotle's model compared to Christianity in particular is, for Aristotle, eternity actually means time. For Augustine, eternity was that which is outside of time. For Aristotle, he thinks the universe has no beginning and no end. The universe just always has been and always will be, and will keep changing. Stars will keep going round, and things on Earth will keep changing, because the prime mover is pushing it on. Prime mover is the motor of the universe. But this isn't to say that the prime mover created it. because it's always existed. Okay. That's all I'm going to say about Aristotle. What I want to do is to move on to Ibn Sina. I've already mentioned, father of modern medicine. Sometimes gets called Avicenna, right? Which is just a kind of like Latinization, isn't it? And there are various things that Avicenna Ibn Sina is responsible for, and I'm going to talk about two. First, there's a distinction between essence and existence. You know, I've talked about we have individuals and we have the types of things they are, right? That's the difference between the fact that you are and what you are. That's what Avicenna calls the difference between essence and existence. And crucially, what's unique about his idea is that this idea of whatness or essence, a type of thing something is, right, is separated from existence. And that means that we can conceive things that don't exist. We can think about essences that are perhaps impossible. So if I went back to talking about the round square, well, the round square, we know what it is. It's round and it's square, right? But it doesn't exist because it can't exist. We can think about essences that aren't real. And what this enables Ibn Sina to do is to basically develop a form of the cosmological argument. We've already done the ontological argument, the existence of God. This argument, the ontological argument, to take Ibn Sina's terms, proceeds from essence to its existence. And the ontological argument is God's essence is to exist. Whereas Ibn Sina's argument goes in the opposite direction. And it starts with the fact that the universe exists. Things exist. And this is a very Aristotelian way to start. You go, look around you. There are things. The world is here. Right? And then tries to argue from that to the necessary existence of a God with a particular kind of essence. Right? Opposite way around. Again, Platonism on the one hand, Aristotelianism on the other. So, how does this argument work? Hopefully we'll talk about this more in seminars. Here is a reconstruction of it. So, one, we start with the fact that things exist, right? But we can conceive of things that don't. That's the crucial upshot of this distinction between essence and existence. You can say, look, things exist, but we can think about things that don't. Two, what do we mean by this conceivable essence? Right? Or these conceivable essences? Well, we might talk about necessary things. We might talk about actual things. We might talk about possible things. And we might talk about impossible things. Right? These are all things we can conceive. What we're interested in is what does it mean for the things we conceive to exist. And necessary existence is fair enough, right? Actual existence and possible existence, that's where things are tricky. What's the difference between something that actually exists but not necessarily, right? And something which doesn't exist but is possible? What's that difference? what that difference is. Right? Actuality is cause. Like, if you actually exist, there is a reason you actually exist. There is some cause that makes you actual rather than merely possible. Okay? But there are two different kinds of causation. There is self-causation. You just make yourself exist. And there's other causation. You know. I think most of us in this room can say we have other cause. I don't think anybody is self-causing. I might be wrong. Here's the next premise. Causation is necessitation. So what is he saying there? He's saying that actually, if you are caused to exist, then you exist by necessity. Something else has made you exist. Right? You have been made to exist by necessity. Okay. Once there's a reason why something is, rather than not, it must be. Right? But, crucially, what this does is kind of kick the can down the road. Because you can also always ask why the thing that caused you to exist itself exists. So we get this kind of causal regress. Okay. How we're doing time-wise? I think we're alright. So what he needs to do now is to talk a bit more about how causation works. So here's how I think this through. Causation involves priority. Which is to say, something comes before something else. Right? And that can be in time, like my dad comes before me. Right? I can't exist without my dad existing, and so on and so on and so on. But it might be some of those atemporal causes, the grounds we talked about in previous right? There might be a chain of non-temporal reasons going back through the laws of physics. Right? Doesn't matter. What's important is there are these relations of priority. Some things come before others. Well, crucially, what he'll argue is these can't involve symmetry. Right? You can't have two things that cause each other. Right? Doesn't think that works. If two things cause each other, there's got to be something else behind them, which is the real cause. And he's also got to say, you can't get out of this by positing cycles. Right? So you can't have like A and B causing each other, but neither can you have A causes B, which causes C, and goes around in a circle. None of those are allowed. Right? Okay. That's basically talking about what it means to have causality as a relation. This is the structure of the relation. Okay. We're getting close now. Composition is causation. What do we mean by composition? Well, composition is the relationship between parts and wholes. So, you know, I'm a whole, but I have parts. I've got arms and legs and a heart and cells and molecules and stuff like that. Right? He's saying that wholes depend upon their parts. Parts, in some sense, cause and have priority over wholes. And the reason he argues this is to essentially say that God has to be simple. Whatever the first cause is, if there is such a thing, right, it's got to be simple. It can't have parts, because if it had parts, those parts would have priority. They'd come before it. Right? The ultimate cause has to be simple. the world, the totality of things, right? The world is composed. The world, everything, is made up of everything, right? And what that means is, as far as he's concerned, the individual parts can't be caused by the whole. You can't say that, well, somehow everything just causes itself, right? Because you can't have these cycles of symmetry, right? So what that means is, there's got to be some ultimate ground, some ultimate reason why everything exists outside of the world itself. Right? So, when we tie that all together, now conclude, I'll just call it the conclusion. What do we get? Well, there's got to be an existent God, and God is simple, self-caused, necessary, existent. God is the ultimate ground of everything, the thing that breaks the regress, right? Right at the end of it all is God as a necessary thing. So everything else in the world is the way it is necessarily because God lies at the end of every chain. In a certain sense, and this comes back to Aristotle, everything in the world, and the world as such, is an act of God. Right? God is pure act, pure actuality, right? No passivity, no components, simple. Right? Yeah. And that's Vincent's argument. His argument for the existence of God and how we have to conceive of God.
Wait, is this called a common mover?
Yes. The other thing I should say, I kind of missed this out, is so Aristotle and Sina think of God as pure thought. They think that what God is thought thinking itself, pure self-contemplation. Okay. Which again is kind of like an activity, but it's an activity which is unchanging. It's a weird flip from Augustine. Right? Augustine is, God is some sort of idea outside of time. Whereas Aristotle and Sina are, God is thought thinking itself inside of time and thereby moving the entire world. Okay. Any other clarificatory stuff for that? It's powerful. It's like a really, really thoroughly worked out argument. Like this is, well, this will be like 11th century, I think. Very, very sophisticated argument, which depends upon a bunch of distinctions and a bunch of philosophical ideas. Okay. What I want to do now is introduce you to the exact opposite of Ibn Sina, a contemporary French philosopher called Quentin Meillassoux. And Meillassoux, I think the best way I've ever heard him described, it's like someone independently reinvented Christian theology, like from first principles. Like someone, like you burned all the copies of the Bible and every bit of Christian text, and someone was asked to kind of recreate it in a clean room, right? This is what Meillassoux does. Through, again, deploying some quite sophisticated philosophical distinctions. What I want to start with, though, is why. So, let's come back to Anne Frank. What Meillassoux says is that there are, well, they're what he calls spectres. Right? He doesn't mean literal ghosts. What he means is deaths. And some deaths are fine. Some people die after living complete fulfilled lives, and other people die in abject misery for no reason. Right? And the latter kind is what he calls an essential spectre, right? Which for him is fundamentally an injustice. People die unjustly, right? And he thinks that confronting this fact is confronting what he calls essential grief. The tragedy of Anne Frank's death is a kind of grief that we have to run through and mourn, right, conceptually. Right? And he thinks that neither religion nor atheism is capable of doing so. So crucially, he thinks that what we need is a superior conception of salvation. I said at the beginning of term that if you want to take away the one concept that is most important in Christianity, it's salvation. Right? Meillassoux thinks Christianity itself is insufficiently committed to the concept of salvation. Right? But what he thinks is the only thing that can truly make up for the injustice of this essential grief is the literal resurrection of the dead. Right? When I ask, could Anne Frank live again? Right? He thinks that is literally the only thing that could make up for the actual injustice of history. Pretty radical. Right? And he thinks that neither religion nor atheism can think this. Religion can't, because he thinks theodicy is a perversion of justice. He thinks theodicy, like we talked about under Augustine, is essentially impossible. Every theodicy always has to explain away real injustice as somehow really justice.
What about the resurrection and the miracles in the Bible?
Oh, this is completely independent of that. Like I say, it's like he recreates some ideas from Christianity without the actual Christian text. So yeah, he basically thinks theodicy is an abomination because you have to explain horrible things that happen in the world as actually the result of God's love. And he thinks that can never be done. If you do it, you yourself are abandoning justice. For the atheist, though, he thinks that they also abandon justice because they abandon hope. He thinks that it's important to hope for the complete form of justice, which can and only will be the complete resurrection of the dead. That all of those who were unjustly threatened life get another chance. Right? He'll say, atheists, in rejecting this possibility, you have also rejected justice. So what he says is the options we've been given thus far appear to be either God exists or God doesn't. And in either case, what we get is injustice. And those look to be the only two options. His response is interesting. What he says is there is a third option. And the third option is God doesn't exist yet. The opposition between religion and atheism, as far as he's concerned, is an opposition about necessary existence. The religious say God necessarily exists, and the atheist says God necessarily doesn't exist. And his position is, no, God could exist, and may at some point in the future. And the existence of God in the future would be the creation of the world of justice. The creation of the state in which the resurrection of everybody who's unjustly died becomes possible. Okay. This is, it's kind of mad, but it's also incredibly audacious. And it forces us to think what we mean by justice. Right? Here's very quickly how he gets here. So, you know, I made that distinction earlier between this sort of epistemic sense of possibility, like certainty and uncertainty. Could things be otherwise than we think they are? And this more, what we call a lethic sense, which is, could things actually have been different? What Meillassoux says is, when we doubt, when we challenge whether or not a certain thing is in fact, a certain bit of knowledge is in fact certain, right? When we say like, no, you could be wrong about that. What we actually tap into is a deeper notion of possibility. We tap into the real possibility that the world could have been otherwise. Right, so when we question, like, wait a minute, did Oswald really shoot Kennedy? Right, we tap into the real possibility that the world could have been otherwise, that somebody else could have done it, even if they didn't actually do it. And he thinks that this possibility goes all the way. This ultimately reveals that all facts are contingent. So we could ask, could the law of gravity, right, be otherwise than it is? Like, you're seeing Newton's theory isn't quite right, Einstein's theory might not be quite right. You can ask, like, could it be otherwise? And he thinks what this reveals is the very real possibility that the law simply could change. He thinks laws of nature are themselves contingent. Right? The world could, tomorrow, simply stop working the way in which we think it works for no reason. So what he says is, the only thing that is necessary is contingency itself. Now he thinks that things like mathematics and logic, they're probably fine. They're part of the structure of contingency. But any of the stuff that Aristotle is interested in, the actual facts on the ground, the things we see in the world, all of those could change. And here's where things get particularly weird. Because what he will say is, what people attempted to say in response to Meillassoux is they attempted to go, well, like, what's the likelihood of laws changing? What's the likelihood that laws is going to look differently tomorrow? Right? We've seen it work the same way for the whole history of the universe thus far. Like, what reason do we have to believe that it might just change? What he says is that this way of thinking about things in terms of probability, in terms of chance, can't actually comprehend the reality of contingency. So, thinking about things probabilistically is like thinking that the universe is a dice. Right? There's a certain number of faces, and you roll it, and one of them will turn up. What Meillassoux will say is, that isn't a number of faces that you could give the universe. There is no way of trying to understand the totality of what is possible. Contingency is so extreme that it exceeds any attempt to think about it in terms of probability. So the question of how likely is the world of justice? How likely is God spontaneously coming into existence and resurrecting the dead? The question is meaningless, as far as he is concerned. But the fact that the question is meaningless does not mean that that possibility should not be thought. In fact, he thinks we must think that possibility. He thinks that the very possibility of ethics, the very possibility of orienting ourselves in the world towards the good and the just is dependent on us accepting this radical possibility that at some point, for no reason, we have the resurrection of the dead. Right? Salvation might just spontaneously happen for no reason. And that's the exact opposite of Ibn Sina. Right? Ibn Sina, God is that which makes everything necessary. God is the necessary existent that makes everything the way it is. For Meillassoux, everything could be anywhere. We live with hyper chaos. Right? But God might pop out of that hyper chaos for no reason. Right. So, two final points. In the seminar, I kind of want you to consider both halves of this, if possible. I'd like you to think about the Ibn Sina's argument and really think about whether you think the world is necessary or whether there are things in it that might be unnecessary, that might be just contingent. What's the relationship between necessity and contingency? Right. And secondly, I'd like you to ask yourselves, can there be justice without the resurrection of the dead? This is an important question for anyone in the Christian tradition. Like, do you think we actually need the literal resurrection of the dead for justice to be realized? Okay? Catch you guys next week.